All right, it's 7 o'clock. So
Why
start. I think we'll
schools
have more-
especially. Very
Yeah. I think we'll have more people joining us but we're going to go ahead and get started. It's going to be our October virtual show table. I think probably everybody should mute themselves except for Terry and Courtney, obviously. We want to welcome our new members, Dolly, Jill, Alex, and Becky. Welcome to the St. Augustine Orchid Society. And without further ado, we will turn this over to the good doctor.
Well, as usual, we have one heck of a series of photos. It's just amazing what our growers have in their greenhouses and their lanais and in their backyard and under their lights. I mean, every single one of these, I see something I've never seen before. And I've said often that one of the advantages of the Zoom that I do like is it gives me a chance to find out a bunch about things I've never seen. But what keeps happening is there are new species that not only haven't I seen, almost no one else has either, because you can't find almost anything about them. They're just very, I guess, rare in the sense that they're not in cultivation. But when you look at them on the photos, you'd say they should be in cultivation. And this Shinorchis really is pretty. We were chatting before everyone got on about the beautiful little nectaries on this, and the fact that we had this photo of the plant in bud. I guess that was the last time, Sue?
Yeah, last month.
And just wondered how pretty it was going to be. And it's just a beautiful little thing. Shinorchis is a pretty good sized genus. As I recall, it's in the Vanda group, and looks really different than a lot of the other Vandaceous orchids. But very beautiful and grown by Leslie. We should have known that just by looking at it.
Yeah.
Next. Labiata September Mist. This is a semi-alba form of Labiata. And one of the real fascinating things about Labiata, for those of you who don't know, the whole Cattleya genus was based on Cattleya labiata that was collected and sent to England. And the person that collected it apparently neglected to put down the location. And this was lost for many, many decades. No one knew where it was and no one could find it, despite looking everywhere. And one of the interesting things about the species, when it was refound, it wasn't widely distributed where it's from. And these rare color forms were extraordinarily valuable, and they still are today. This semi-alba clone is a really nice one. You can see it's got an award of merit. Just the large petals and sepals and that beautiful contrast of the white petals and sepals with this beautiful color depth. Really nice. I'm guessing this would have been a phenomenal thing to have in hybridizing had they had it years ago.
Oh, yeah.
Next.
Started with a nap, pleasant vegging, and a workout, and it ended with good coffee and a breakfast burrito.
Okay, I'm gonna mute Courtney. You go ahead.
Okay. Cattleya maxima. This is a striking color form. Cattleya maxima is a beautiful species. It comes from high elevation and low elevation. The low elevation forms tend to have bigger flowers, but they're lighter. And some of the high elevation forms are dark, but I just never seen one quite this dark. This is an extraordinarily beautiful flower. That's Allen's. And it's interesting seeing this particular species being used in hybridization now, producing some beautiful offspring. We're just not having ready access to a lot of them. I suspect it's because the species and the hybrids have a reputation for being a little difficult to grow. And in fact, the dark color forms are from higher elevations and light cooler temperatures. So it may take a while before we get enough, I won't say hybridizing, but line breeding to get some that'll grow better in warmer conditions. Next. A real oldie, Cattleya Bob Betts. This goes back into the 1950s. This is Bowbells by Mossy, and Bowbells was that first original phenomenal thing that popped up in the war years. And Sue, do you know if this is from the original Bob Betts hybrid?
I think it was. It was a gift. Helen Hoffman gave it to me, and I think it was.
And the story that's interesting about this particular hybrid is the RHA lists this cross as Bowbells by Mossy. And after this was first bloomed, the cross was remade so many times by so many different people using Cattleya Mossy. None of them came out to be like this. And it turns out that the reason is that the species that they used, they called Mossy, was one of those ones they couldn't quite figure out what it was. And it turns out that it was a natural hybrid between Mossy and Ludemaniana.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and in fact, there's still people who disagree with this, but the fact is that it has all of the characteristics of that hybrid, and that hybrid still exists today. It's called Stanleyi. Is that right? That may not be right, but it's around today. This exact clone is around today. Somebody ought to remake that and see what comes out. But it's a beautiful flower, and none of the other remakes came out nearly as good as that original one. Well grown, Sue.
Yeah, and it had 3 more flower spikes too. I mean,
Yeah.
Isn't that what you say about the Mossy? Is that it brings out the
Yeah.
auriferousness of a hybrid?
Yeah, Mossy is a great parent, and it also was really great for the cut flower business, just because anything made with Mossy tended to stay in the pot and produce lots of flowers on 2 growths each year. So you got a lot of flowers.
Yeah.
Next. This is still summer in terms of the orchids flowering, the Cattleyas particularly. And here we have 3 very nice ones. Cattleya Caudebec. This is a really interesting both clone and species. Caudebec has been made a number of times, and one of the crosses, one of the real nice clones was meristemmed. And when the meristems were growing up, a number of the people who were looking at them realized that there were some that were a little different, and they turned out to be tetraploids. And those tetraploids have been used extensively to make hybrids. The one thing that I will tell you, if you've tried growing Caudebec or any of its offspring, and sometimes this is a generic thing to say about bifoliates, a lot of times when the buds are forming and it's really warm, the buds secrete a kind of a nectar, and essentially it can be so thick, unless you're really wetting the flowers on a regular basis, that it glues the flower shut, and the flowers will try to open, but essentially the petals and sepals are all glued together and they'll never open. I had this happen with a number of my favorite bifoliates this year because I didn't see them starting to swell early enough. But it's something to remember. And of course, there's a good story about Cattleya Sioux Bottom Rosemary. There's always a good story about anything with Sioux Bottom involved. But Rose and I were visiting a nursery in North Carolina, and it was, maybe 60 foot long. And we opened the front door, and Rose just instantly said, "What is that?" ignoring all of the spectacular things on the benches, and walked right back to this particular plant because it was about 4.5 foot high, a massive head of flowers. And it was really striking in terms of the color and just the way in which the flowers were held. And this was the cross. It was a first bloom seedling. And this was the cross that I later named for Sue. And Rosemary is, of course, my wife. And since it was her pick, she always picks the best. It gets the Rosemary name. And of course, Mrs. Mailer on the left is one of the parents of it. And you can see the similarities. But essentially, it's an interesting hybrid because it mixes many of the species that are found that we consider bifoliates. And in a perfect way, as this particular cross illustrates, the flower is really beautiful, spots, it's nice colored, but the cross itself had a number of different color forms, including some with a green background. You can see that in Mrs. Mailer, others with a very dark background and no spots. but they were all beautiful with large numbers of flowers. And that's, of course, a good thing for any orchid growers to have lots and lots of flowers. Okay, next. Our club definitely has become nodosa hybrid aficionados because we all have lots of them. And each month we have them. It isn't just we have 1 or 2 months. They seem to be in bloom for some of us 12 months of the year. And that's one of the things that people really like about them. Binosa Wabash Valley is, I think, one of my favorite clones. Beautiful spotting on the lip, an intense green color, very easy to grow. They like heat, they like light. So for a grower in Florida, this is just about perfect. On the right, on the upper right, instead of using nodosa, they use tuberculata, which is a closely related species. The thing that's really different about tuberculata is they have a lot of flowers at one time. And the spikes look a little different. It's crossed with Cattleya intermedia, and both of these species tend to be really dominant. And what I love about this hybrid is it's one of the few examples where you sort of see an intermediate form between two very dominant species. The lip is beautiful. You can see the nodosa in it, but the framing of the flower just says intermedia. And I'll bet in this hybrid, there were a lot of pink colored flowers and pale, different combinations. The only surprise there is that they're not spots. And I'm not sure if tuberculata throws the spots like nodosa does or not. Just haven't seen enough tuberculata crosses. Now down below is Brassalalia virginia, but I think this is now called a Brassicattleya, nodosa by Latona. Here we see the spots on both the petals and the lip. And if you look around the side of the lip, you can see the spots are everywhere. So you can get all sorts of combinations. And my bet is this is a pretty young plant, and it's going to get a whole lot more flowers as that gets to be more mature. Next. We used to call this BLC. And one of the things that has happened is the Central American Cattleyas, what we used to call the Central American Cattleyas, have been put into another group. The Guaranthe include some really beautiful species, Skinneri, Beringiana, Araniaca, that have been integrated in so many Cattleyas over the millennia, basically, since we've been making these hybrids. And here we have essentially a hybrid put back on nodosa. And the hybrid uses the Central American Araniaca in a beautiful way. Look at the inflorescence, how they stand up so perfectly. It's one of the characteristics of some of those species. They have nice inflorescences, lots of flowers, and Araniaca is really dominant when it comes to color. That's a really nice clone. I don't think I've ever seen this one before. Celsus amaretto. Nice. Next. Brassa epidendrums. This is pretty. Sylvia white, Nodosa bacillari. An epidendrum crossed with a brassivola. We used to call these beppies. And here we have two beppies. Beppy Sylvia white, this is Nodosa bacillari, and green dragon, which is the native species found here in Florida and even in our locale, Magnoliae by Nodosa. And you can see the characteristics of both species in both of these. And look at how that green dragon, look how dense that plant is. If you've ever seen Magnolia grow in the wild, it's a pretty densely growing plant. Little tiny leaves and bulbs on oak trees, especially around here. But the plant is dense, and so is Nodosa. You sure see it there. Lots of flowers on this particular plant. Really nice. Nice green color. Next. This is a species I'm very surprised we don't see more often. Laelia anceps is from Mexico. In the wild form, they're beautiful pink flowers. There are a lot of varieties. Some of them have beautiful flares. There are cerulean colors. There are albas. lots of variations in the natural populations. And some of the populations are also real different in terms of sizes of plants, but they can be fairly large plants and they can have fairly large flowers. I've seen Laelia anceps that are 8 inches across. They also have a tremendous resistance to cold. In some of the areas where they grow, it gets down to freezing at night. And so in Southern California, where it's mostly warm, but they have these occasional cold spells, I've seen them growing on rocks in people's yards. So they have been naturalized in Southern California. I'm not sure how cold they can take, but I know at one location they told me that they had been down to 25 degrees, and their Laelia anceps didn't show any sign of dying. So it is something that might actually grow out here. And a lot of hybridizers used to like that characteristic, and it's in quite a few hybrids. The form tends to dominate in terms of the shape of the flower, but 2 generations removed, the flower still can be pretty round, and they have this phenomenal inflorescence that can be 18, 24 inches above the leaves. And you can see that on this one on the growing on the left. And they can have 3 or 4 or 5 flowers too, not just 1 or 2. Next. Kenhamiema variety Cerulean, Azure Skies. This hybrid was made with the Cerulean form of mossy and a form of Laelia purpurata called Werkhauseri, which is intensely pigmented. It's almost a violet, not just Cerulean. And there's still some interest in trying to figure out exactly what the genes are in that purpurata that does this, but it's not quite the same as a lot of the other Cerulean forms. Looks like these flowers aren't quite as open as they will get. It will get a pretty good flower count too. Not unusual to have 4 or 5 flowers on this particular hybrid. But this is one of the more beautiful clones of Kenhamiena Cerulean. A lot of Kenhamienas out there, including semi-albas, but this is a Cerulean one. There's a pale Cerulean to the petals and sepals, but it's that intense violet lip that really sets this clone off. Next. Here's another famous Cattleya hybrid. This is Cattleya luminosa, used to be Laelia Cattleya luminosa. And if you're familiar at all with hybridizing yellow Cattleyas, you'll notice that both Dowiana and Tenebrosa are the parents of this. And you get a pretty good understanding of what both species can do. Dowiana is probably the Aurea form, is a yellow that has intense color in the lip. Usually the lip has got a lot of mottling and striping and so forth, but beautiful dark lip. And the Tenebrosa has this particular colored lip, and it's more rounded. This is one of the original clones that was made, that was used to breed more yellows. So look in the background of just about any standard yellow Cattleya, and you'll find luminosa typically multiple times in the background. It's got so many good characteristics. It's a little difficult to grow, simply because both species are a little difficult to grow, but they're easier to grow than either species by themselves. Next. Imperial Labaran. This is a really another classic clone. Cattleya Enid is a primary hybrid, a beautiful thing, used to be real popular in the cut flower trade. There were semi-albas and standards, but amongst the hobbyists in Europe, these large estates that raised orchids, this was an extremely popular hybrid to make and to grow. And they were successful at producing some clones that were really big and round. They would match up well with any standard Cattleya around today in terms of the shape. Elizabeth Off was a famous hybrid made by George Off in his nursery in New Jersey. And it's extremely dark. And this is a combination of the two, Imperial Labaran. It's really beautiful. That's, again, an older approach to hybridizing, but if you had it in your collection, you would want to keep it. It's that kind of an orchid. Next. Here we have another really interesting hybrid. It's one, I'm surprised we don't see more of this particular hybrid. Um, as I mentioned earlier, the Central American species were integrated into Cattleyas, and now we just have separated them into a separate group. All it really does is change that first name, the generic name. But this is Cattleyanthi panapasa, and it uses a bifoliate, Cattleya guttata, and then Adolf Heckler, which is a beautiful, beautiful dark Cattleya on a nice stem. It's a cross of Beringiana. I don't remember what the other parent is, but they're still around. And what I was surprised at when I saw this coming into bloom and saw this photo, Cattleya guttata is in bloom right now, and so is Cattleya beringiana, which are two of the species in the background of this. And notice the inflorescence. Notice how it's well held above the foliage, characteristic of the beringiana and the guttata. In fact, the arrangement on the inflorescence is pretty much a beringiana arrangement. Lots of flowers closely held together. And this is one of those from Raymond Burr's collection. He had an amazing collection of orchids. And when he died, they were distributed all over the United States and the world because of his name. But they were all exquisite plants too. Next. Here's another sort of approach to Cattleya hybridizing. This is a fairly small growing plant, tropical pointer variety cheetah. And it's really nice in the sense it doesn't take up much space. It's an intermediate cross, which is a good species to use to get certain characteristics, particularly vigor, into hybrids. And it also produces a really nice lip. And the other characteristic that I've always liked about it is that they're free flowering. Many times they'll flower multiple times a year, depending upon what you put with it. Tropical Glow is a real interesting parent. And there are many varieties of this particular hybrid. Most have spots. There are a few that don't, but they all have this beautiful pink color and this contrasting yellow and fuchsia lip, I guess you'd say. It's the column that's yellow. Some are bright yellow, some are less, some are pure white. So you just get this amazing array of different clones in this particular hybrid. Next. Semi-albas have and probably always will be one of my favorite color forms of standard Cattleyas. This is Memoria Anna Balmoris variety Carmela. Memoria Robert Strait is a famous semi-alba, which also produced some cerulleas, which is kind of interesting. But it has this nice characteristic of having a very large lip relative to the petals and sepals that opens partially so that that yellow that's in the throat kind of stands out in contrast with the lip. And it has these beautiful little flares on the petals and sepals. Sometimes they can be bigger and sometimes smaller. It's got a lot to do with the growing conditions. But it's a free flowering thing. It'll again flower multiple times a year. Very nice clone to have. Below is Brassicatlia Hawaiian Stars. So this is another Brassivola Little Stars crossed with Memoria Robert Strait. So both of these have a common parent, but the other parent in one case is a Brassivola, and the other case it's a standard Cattleya, which is good news. It's beautiful semi-alba. Next. Cattleya Intermedia by Morning Glory. Beautiful thing. Morning Glory is probably, if someone asked me what should be the first orchid that I have if I want to really be serious and learn how to grow orchids, it's probably Morning Glory because it's a fairly easy to grow clone, and it gives flowers even when you're not growing it perfectly well. But this is being grown very well. And this is Intermedia by Morning Glory. And it's, again, it seems to be a very vigorous clone. And so I can't quite tell if the clone to the right is exactly the same. It looks like it's the same hybrid.
Yeah, I think it's the color doesn't come through true on the photograph.
Yeah, because these all should be, they all
Yeah.
should be white and not yellow. But having said that, sometimes when a white flower first opens, it'll have a little bit of a pale green color until the flower hardens, and then it's a nice white. But all beautiful, easy to grow. Next, Bryce Canyon splendiferous, another very famous clone. If you look at dark cattleyas and large dark cattleyas, you will see this in many hybrids. It's a really interesting story in that this cross was made at Armacost and Royston, and the hybridizer told me when I asked him about it that this was the only clone in the whole Grex that came out with these characteristics. He said some were good, but nothing like this. And this actually has a lot of the genes and the parentage from Norman's Bay, which is another famous dark one. And the only other clone I know that is nearly as good as this was from a selfing made of this particular clone. Some claim it's better, looks a lot like the same thing to me. It is a great parent, and you would probably see a lot more hybrids around with it, but the nursery that had it held it very tightly and did not distribute clones and pollen so that other hybridizers could use it for a long time. So, and it came out about the same time as Oconee, except Oconee was distributed all around the world almost immediately after it flowered by one of the first mirror clones, and this one was tightly held. It still is a great parent. I've used it a couple of times with good success, and I still look for hybrids with either this as a parent or as a grandparent. That color in the lip, that yellow that you see, is a characteristic that comes out almost every single time. Next. I thought this was really surprising. The one on the left, Chia Lin, which is a beautiful dark cattleya, big flower, nice round shape, crossed with Brassavola nodosa. And the color of the Chia Lin, it's a Oconee cross, came through. And all the nodosa added was the typical things, the beautiful lip, but look at all the little spots on there. It's nodosa shape. And one of the things that I've noticed about this kind of hybrid that I still find surprising is they tend to have few flowers. Even when grown to their maximum, you typically only see 2 or 3 flowers, which was surprising given the fact that nodosa will typically have 4 or 5 on a good nodosa. That's beautiful, Alan. And then on the right side is another Chia Lin hybrid, and this is the more typical approach using this. This is crossed with Christy Yamaguchi, the famous skater. And here you see the typical result from Chia Lin hybrids. Large flowers, extraordinarily dark. And anyone who tries to photograph dark cattleya flowers will tell you it truly is impossible to catch the same colors that your eye tells you you're seeing when you see the real plant. And it's got a lot to do with the texture of the flower. The flower for Oconee has almost a satiny texture. Sometimes it looks like velvet, and you just can't get that same idea in a photograph that your brain sees when it sees the real thing. This is growing really well. It's a fairly small plant relative to what this is going to do, and it is something I should mention more often. When you're interested in growing cattleyas, big flowered cattleyas, the real trick is to grow them into large plants. When you've got 8 mature bulbs on a cattleya, you will get monster flowers compared to what you'll get on the first bloom. And you'll also see the form improve from good to phenomenal. So just remember that if you've been a little discouraged by a first bloom seedling, you've got to grow it out more. If the color is good, even if the shape isn't quite what you want, grow it on 2 or 3 more years, and you'll be surprised what you'll get out of that. Next. Well, this has definitely been a cattleya month, hasn't it? This is Brassicatantha, Aloha Mermaid. Aloha Case is a famous Walteriana hybrid. I can't remember what Little Mermaid is, but I love the flowers. And if you look at the size of the basket it's growing on, it's not a big basket. It's not a big plant. And again, this is one of the characteristics of Walkeriana in the background. They'll keep the plant somewhat small with beautiful flat blooms and typically have nice color. And this is a good example. Take a look at the roots growing on this basket. This is the way they really love to grow. And the best part about it, if you're interested in getting a mature plant, is to be able to not lose the roots by having to repot. And in a basket like this, looks like maybe there's rock in there, should never have to repot till that basket disintegrates in a decade or two. Next. Oh, this is every time I see this flower, I instantly think it's Toshioki, which is one of the parents. Toshioki was probably the breakthrough yellow. Not that there weren't great yellows before, but great yellows didn't grow well before. And this was Toshioki was a hybrid produced by an amateur in Hawaii. And it does something that is, I won't say unique to it, but it has this natural tendency to have these flares. And Cattleya muscombe also has flares. I'm not sure what kind of clone they used. I'm not aware of a lot of really bright yellow clones of muscombe, but Toshioki is a bright yellow like this with a gorgeous lip just like this and flares. And it typically is fairly easy to grow, even here in Florida, where bright yellow Cattleyas were hard to come by that grew well. And anytime you see Toshioki in the background of a cross, you can bet it's going to be a good grower. And most of them have been bred to be yellows. They're maxed with a yellow. So this is Dora Lulisa Capon, variety Leah. Really pretty, Sue.
Oh, that thing, it's the best blooming that's had in like 5 years. Big, flat. It was gorgeous this year.
Yeah, it looks like it. I can almost taste it. Next. Serengeti Sands. This is my cross. So Carter and Holmes got the pod and sold a lot of seedlings. And this is the only one I've ever taken to judging. It got an AM. There are beautiful colors in this particular hybrid, but what still shocks the heck out of me is that Teresa Smile was a in bloom plant I saw at Carter and Holmes that they had, I think, for sale for like $10 because they didn't like the lip. It had a little cut lip, which is what this has, a little semi isthmus lip, characteristic of bifoliates. And that's not what you're usually looking for when you make a big standard Cattleya hybrid, but it was what I was looking for to make this cross. Cattleya tigrina used to be called Leopoldii, but it's a small flower. And the shock about this particular cross is the size of the flowers. The typical way in which it works, if you cross a big flower with a small flower, you get something in between in the hybrid. But several of these clones of this particular hybrid have been bigger than the parent, the Teresa Smile, and all have been huge compared to Cattleya tigrina. I think this particular flowering, I had six flowers on the inflorescence. But nice color. This is the time of year they like summer and they like the heat. The bigger the plant gets, the more flowers you get. And again, it's the same thing with mature Cattleya. Gives you more and bigger flowers than smaller size plants. Next. This is just such a classic. It's nice to see it's still around. This is variety Elmhurst, Greenwich Elmhurst. I just remember seeing this for sale at Hauserman's in Chicago. It's one of the first really good greens. It stayed green after you got it. It's an interesting hybrid if you look at the background. And both of these parents have been important in producing green hybrids, Ann Follis and Lester McDonald. But this is just such a classic one. I'm just glad to see it still out there and flowering and healthy. Beautiful green color. Next. Rhyncholelia cattleya skyscape, Hawaiian gold, which is a big yellow, and Tsinghua nugget. I don't know much about, but the Hawaiian gold has been used a lot in Taiwan and in Hawaii, just because it produces with extreme regularity really nice offspring. And the other thing that I really like about this particular plant is the inflorescence. If you look at the way in which the flowers and the spike come off of the sheath and how they're spaced, almost guaranteeing you that Tsinghua nugget has some species in the background that have lots of flowers well held above the foliage, because that's just not characteristic of big flowered cattleyas. But hybridizers integrated things just right to get this combination. Next.
Oh.
Okay, Sue, down. Whenever I go to a show and I get the chance, I wonder, looking through all the booths, even though the last thing I need is another cattleya in my collection. And what I'm looking for, of course, is something extraordinary or something really different. And this was in Jim Roberts' sales booth. Jim Roberts, see, what's his nursery?
Florida
Suncoast. Suncoast. I never heard of this cross. I couldn't, when I saw it, if you'd asked me what is in it, I would have had a hard time just even making guesses. And it's pretty fascinating because what it has in it are species that you don't normally see put together. It's got the Brotonia sanguiana in the background, which is from the Caribbean, a little hot growing thing you would never imagine it's in there. But the combination of the tessellations and the spots and the color, to me, was just extraordinary. Now, when I got it home, I've discovered something else that often is a terrible characteristic, and that is the yellow color went away. But in this particular case, when the yellow color goes away, it turns into an ivory with all of the same markings. The lip is still red and the yellow throat, and it is just as pretty. And again, something I didn't know, it lasts 6 weeks at least. And I would say that this plant, the mother plant, probably stays in bloom for 2.5 or 3 months in the summer, one inflorescence after another. And that is a hard characteristic to find in any orchid of any flower size or shape and variety of pigmentations. So it has become one of my favorites. And I'm betting next year Sue has one now, and it'll probably be dwarf this one by far.
Yes, that was my present today. Wonderful.
Go next slide. Oh, here we have just some real neat things. The Epiphyllalia cattleya, now Epicatanthe, again, the Central American cattleya types, integrated with an encyclia, or an epidendrum, I'm sorry. And you see these beautiful heads of flowers. Epidendrum stamfordianum is a fascinating species that does great things to whatever you put it with. You don't have to be a brilliant hybridizer. All you have to do is have stamfordianum and just put it with anything you want that's got color, and the offspring will be pretty. You can almost guarantee. This is named after a famous hybridizer in California. On the other side is Christie Masahara variety Paradise. And did you get this from me, Sue?
Yes, I did. I should have put that note on there. You brought this back for me from, I don't know.
Oh, that's right, from Hawaii Hybrids. And the interesting story about this is that we were at the nursery, and it's one of the large nurseries where they raise a lot of things. And after a certain length of time, even though the bench may be half full of plants and pots, they basically take them all and push them to a giant pile in the back of the bench. These are 20-foot benches, and throw them away and put new things on there. I mean, that's the nature of the business. And there was this one giant stack back there. Most of the plants were dead, and this inflorescence sticking up with 4 fly flowers. And Rose saw it and she says, I want that. So I was attempting to dig through and get it. And the owner, Jared, I think he felt guilty that I was digging through there, and he went and pulled it out, and the plant was in really terrible shape. But I said, no, Rose wants it. I want it. So he actually sent it to me for free, didn't charge me anything. And when he sent the package to me, he sent, they had recloned it. So essentially a second cloning. And he had sent me I think it was a 3 or 4 inch pot, I can't remember, of it. So that's what you got there, Sue.
Yep, I love it.
And mine's blooming too. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
Winey leopard is one of those other hybrids out there that when you cross it with almost anything, you get beautiful color, sometimes spots. This one's got some tessellations. And gold digger is another hybrid. You cross it with anything and you get great stuff. So I'm not surprised this is as good as it is. The only thing I regret is that they only cloned one of the clones from the cross, and there must have been some other amazing things out of this particular Grex. I would like to see that hybrid remade to see all the variations that would come from such a hybrid. Next. Ormara Cattleya, Louise Adele Fuchs. This is Leslie's. We talk all the time about the Shambo cats, which is what we used to call these, and how they love growing in Florida, how they love abandoning their pot, love bright sunshine. I've been growing mine outside on the fence in full sun most of the day, and they turn yellow and they look like hell, and then they bloom like crazy. And this one's growing extremely well. Nice color. I can just imagine the fragrance on that thing, but being grown extremely well by Leslie, of course. But what's most interesting about this particular hybrid is that they use Walkeriana as the other parent. And I mentioned Walkeriana earlier in that it does great things, produces nice flat flowers, and it reduces the size of the plant. If you knew the other parent is huge. And Walkeriana has reduced the size of the plant to something manageable, which is a nice characteristic.
It also shortened the flower stem, because that flower stem.
That's right.
So you
Thank
can
you,
actually
Sue.
see it and appreciate it.
Yeah, that's the other thing about the Shambo cats is some of them have 6 and 8 foot inflorescences. Not something that grows on a windowsill well, even in a greenhouse. You know,
Nope.
when I mean, the ones I have when they bloom in the wintertime, when I have them in the greenhouse, I have to lower the plant almost to the floor so I can see the flowers. They just get such beautiful long spikes. Wonderful in nature, not so wonderful in a greenhouse.
Mm-hmm.
Next. Cymbidium. This is Chen's Ruby. Golden Elf was sort of a breakthrough in Cymbidiums because it grows well in the heat. And that's an important characteristic, particularly for people who wanted to grow Cymbidiums in South Florida. And there were always people wanting to do it because if you came from up north or you came from California, Cymbidiums were sort of something you saw all the time. They were in the grocery stores, bought the inflorescences. They were part of the cut flower trade. And this is a beautiful yellow clone. The Iridioides is as I remember, a warm growing species too, that has an upright spike. So these are beautiful little plants. I'm trying to remember when I first saw these, but I saw whole benches of these growing in South Florida and was shocked at how well they were growing in the heat. Really good growing, Linda. Next. Catasetums, Bound for Glory. Now, who could resist that name? Heliatum by Orchid Glade, and Orchid Glade is one of the famous old ones. It was, I think, the original. I don't know if it was the first one. It was the first modern one I'd seen in South Florida made, and a beautiful thing. That's Sue's, and I don't recall them being this color, Sue. I remember Orchid Glade being like the flower below.
Yeah, I think
Steve Hawkins has. I think this is an albinistic form.
I think it was a remake.
Yeah, I'm sure it was a remake. But I think it's probably remade with the goal of making something that was green or light color. Although it's hard to beat the Orchid Glade, that Jack of Diamonds. You see the color on there. See why people went so nuts after that first hybrid was bloomed in Jones and Scully's nursery. Next. Here we have some more of those wonderful things, except here we have a variation. We have Cloecitum, Jackie Lawson's snowflake freckles, adding a different genus with a lot of the same look. Again, in inflorescence that's hanging down. I don't know much about this particular clone. This is Steve's, but I bet that it blooms multiple times a year. You can almost bet on that. And the one, I love the name, Kidney Beans, Susan Fuchs by Orchid Glade. I mean, Orchid Glade was used so much because they produced a lot of them when they first made this cross. And everyone wanted to see what they could do with it. And so it was crossed with a lot of different things, producing lots of color forms. It's surprising that none of the crosses we've seen with it have had that dark color, because that was one of the things that people really liked. But the beautiful green background is striking too. Next. Gongora, Atropurpurea. You can see the color of this thing, which is where the name comes from, the Atropurpurea. Just intense color. Again, an inflorescence hanging down. One of those species that will produce multi inflorescences every summer. Just nicely grown. This is Janice's. Well done, Janice. Next. Dendrobium. The Inobi purple is in a question mark, so I'm not sure whether this is.
It was annoyed. Whether it's really Inobi purple, who knows?
Well, we've got two names on it, Inobi Komachi and Laguna Princess. The characteristics of the flowers are really nice. The color, lots of flowers, being a lot of flowers right now. Looks like every bulb with leaves has flowers, and maybe one without leaves. I can't quite tell, but being grown very well. It looks like a very, very happy plant. And on the other side is Dendrobium frida or Tanata. Boy, that's got a striking lip on that thing. That is really unusual in terms of the color combination. I'm not familiar with the Metasari mustica. American Beauty is a famous hybrid that's been out there and used a lot. Looks like this one may be just finishing up on flowering or just starting. But it doesn't look like a huge plant. That's going to be interesting to see how that grows as it gets larger and how many flowers it gets. So keep growing that, Deborah. Next. Inobi by Barana Doll. Says the hybrid's not registered, but both of those parents are. There are an awful lot of hybridizers, particularly in Asian countries, that make hybrids and sell them, but don't register them. I mean, it's what, 15 pounds or 14 pounds, Sue? I can't remember how much it is.
Yeah.
It's not a lot, but if you make hundreds of hybrids and you had to pay the money in the Thai currency, it would be a lot to you. So we see a lot of these don't get registered, at least by the hybridizer. Eventually, if somebody really likes it, they'll register it as an unknown origin. But really pretty. I like the color on it, really deep. Again, there's a Nobi in a basket. My preference is not to grow dendrobiums in baskets because it's hard to get them established. The way I would suggest, if you do want to put one in a basket, let the thing keep it in a clay pot until it gets really so thick in the pot that you just know it's got to be redone. And then just take a little hammer and crack the pot and then set that cracked pot in the basket. And eventually the pot will push apart as the roots expand, and you'll wash out old media, and the plant will just adapt right to that basket pretty fast if you can do that. The one on the right looks like he's ready to go into a basket. That pot looks pretty full. and doesn't quite fit in the basket, which is the perfect scenario. Crack that pot. In this case, you might want to just knock the clay off and just drop it in there. Put a little piece of bamboo to hold it into place and let it go. That's a beautiful thing. I guess that's a no name then.
Yeah.
But I love that. I love that pale coloration on that. Really pastel. It's a pretty plant. Nicely grown. Next. Miltonia morelliana. Now you can see the species on the right. This is Linda's, and that is just a really striking flower, and it's a very easy to grow Miltonia. For years, people thought they could use that size and so forth and breed to some of the other Miltonias, the warm growing Miltonias, and be able to make big flowers and so forth. But what you find if you try to make those kinds of hybrids is what you see up there in whatever that hybrid name is, Liliedon violet. You see it's a Morelliana hybrid. And I've got some Morelliana hybrids made with other species that are so different from the Morelliana, but the hybrids I can't tell apart from the Morelliana. It is that dominant. And there are a few orchids around, and there's a Vanda I can think of, and in this case, the Miltonia, that are so super dominant that it just almost doesn't pay to make the hybrid, with one exception. The hybrids are better growers than the straight Morelliana. So if you're okay not caring whether it's a species or a hybrid, you can grow it and you don't even have to tell anybody. They will never know the difference. The plants grows the same, the flowers look the same. And interestingly, it doesn't matter whether it's the pod parent or the pollen parent, which is sometimes really different in species that are so dominant. Next. This is so cute. It's a shame this is not a 4-inch flower. It's just such a beautiful thing. And hybridizers have played with trying to get this form into a larger size with making hybrids. I just don't know how you improve on this beautiful little thing. This is Phalaenopsis deliciosa. It's kind of a hard to find species, not easy to grow. They really like good water. So if you've got hard water, this may not be something you want to try. They also don't like high temperatures. So I've grown these in the past until summer comes, and then they just decline. Now, one of the other things about this group of Phalaenopsis that are real small is if they drop all their leaves, don't throw them away. Some of them intentionally drop their leaves. They're deciduous, and then we'll grow them back when it gets the temperature gets more to their liking. But this is a beautiful one to have. They're not really as expensive now as they once were, but the color on this one is really nice. This is Deborah Brandt's. It's pretty flower. Nice. Next. Doritis. I still can't stop calling this Doritis. The genetics say that it's a Phalaenopsis. What makes it really different is this really tall inflorescence and these small bright flowers. They're not quite as bright in nature. It's usually a lighter color if you have the wild collected forms. But it's a Phalaenopsis that grows out in the open in brush and grass. So essentially it's growing on the surface of the soil, and the roots really don't like to be in media. And the idea is that this tall inflorescence sticks up through the grass so that the pollinators can find it. First ones I saw were pretty dull and the flower form was very open, but hybridizers have done wonders with this particular species. There are white ones, there are cerulean ones, there are flared ones, there are caloric ones in which the petals look like a lip. A lot of variations of color, some almost bordering on rusty colored. It's one of the easiest Phalaenopsis to grow if you can't grow Phalaenopsis. If you grow Phalaenopsis really well, this is going to be hard for you because you're going to treat it with too much kindness. A lot of nurseries used to grow these out with their callias, so in the bright sun. The only problem with that is that the flowers tend to be duller grown in real bright light, and the plants don't look as attractive. but the plants are very upright, narrower leaves, and a lot of times you can identify a hybrid made with them just because of that. Some of the hybrids made with this particular species I've seen in the past were unbelievably strikingly colorful, just bright colors that you don't expect to see in phals. Next. Arangus. That's just beautifully grown, Sue. If you just look at how that's being grown, it looks like you got some Spanish moss around it. They like to be moist. They're African in their background, where they're from. They have these long inflorescences, beautiful white flowers. Again, my experience with these is they like good water. They do not like hard water. And looking at the leaves of this, you can tell it's being grown in pretty high quality water, which I know that Sue has.
And it's really shady. It's grown really shady.
Yeah, they typically like shade. The one, I don't have many of these, but mine grows on the side of the bench, under the phals, under the cattleyas. So it's very, very shady. And I keep it so that it's not really in much of a pot, but it's got Spanish moss all around it, and I water it every time I'm in the greenhouse, even on, even on days where I don't water anything else. It's one that does get watered. Next. Here is an Arides, Punchinello, Odorata by Lawrenceana. These are two real common species. I'm surprised we don't see more Arides among our club members. They're very easy to grow, but hard to get into a plant like this. But you can see exactly what has happened. They tend to throw out lots of kikis or basal growths off the old stem, and they grow pretty fast. And in no time at all, you can have not just the main stem flowering, but 2 or 3 of the stems that are side shoots flowering. And the hardest part is, how do you keep a plant like this contained, give it enough space to do what it can do, like you see here. And what tends to happen is people break them up pretty frequently, just because they do take a lot of space when they get to be as big and beautiful as something like this. But as being grown, that's Sue's. Very beautiful. And the species that make the hybrid too, both of them are very nice and have those same characteristics. Next. Bulbophyllum baileyii. Leslie seems to have the corner on unusual species. This is one I don't think I've ever seen except in Leslie's greenhouse. It's a really different looking bulbophyllum. It doesn't quite match the standard form, a cupped flower. And it's a shame we can't have a video, because you could probably tell it was a bulbophyllum by the lip on being cantilevered and wobbling. But if you look at the growths themselves, you can see the new growths are somewhat separated from the old ones. So this is one of those bulbophyllums, and there are many that are difficult to contain in a pot or even a basket. You have to come up with some way of just letting it wander around in a big basket or on a hanging mount or something along those lines. Can't quite tell whether this is in a mount or exactly what this is in, but whatever it's in, it's a very, very happy bulbo.
Oh,
The other thing is they need a lot of water. You can't overwater them. And I should have known. Leslie's doing good with this one.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's the last one. It's on a wood mount from Leslie. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. That's a good way to do it. I think that's the last one.
Courtney, you were wonderful as always.
Thank everyone for their patience. It always takes longer to do these than I expect it's going to, but that's because we have so many sending in so many neat photos. It's really very different than what we do when we do show tables at meetings.
I think there's not a lot of these plants we would never have seen on the show table. They're just too big to bring in.
That's right. And sometimes there can be a beautiful plant on the show table that you pass over because there's so many giant things with lots of flowers next to it, when the flowers themselves are tiny but spectacular. And the way we do it here with the photos, you actually can see those flowers, and your attention is on the flower because you don't get distracted by all kinds of other things.
Yeah, so true. Well, thank you, Courtney. You were just terrific, as you always are.
It was fun, everyone. Thanks for attending.
Yeah. So for the thing, for what's coming up, this weekend is the Oktoberfest out at EFG. For anybody that's interested, George and Paula gonna have a food truck down there and lots of specials, and tropicals and orchids. So that's a great opportunity if you wanna, if you've been jonesing for an orchid show.
Hey, I resent that remark.
Yeah, yeah. And then our meeting next month, and our meeting falls on election night. In fact, we're going to have our SAOS elections, but usually that's a pretty small meeting, pretty underattended meeting. Courtney tells me the story about how he had a presentation in Charlotte one time to the Orchid Society. It happened to be on Super Bowl night, the night the Panthers were playing. So Courtney, how many people were there for your?
Well, it started out about 40, and then about 1:30 or 2, just before I started to talk, they served the food and then everybody left.
So
a good dedicated 12 people, Sue.
yeah. So we're going to be playing bingo for orchids on our meeting night. It's going to be a fun night. We're going to we've got prizes to give to the bingo winners. We'll be having, offering 10 bingo cards for $10, and then we'll play for prizes, and we'll get you home in plenty of time to watch the election return. So it's just going to be a fun night on November 3rd. And then for our next show table, send in your picks by the end of the month.
Yeah, we should have a lot of beautiful dark cattleyas, a lot of the standards. This is fall. This next month will be sort of the peak of an awful lot of the classic cattleyas.
Yep. And hopefully everybody's working and planning what they're going to do with their orchids this winter and getting their areas ready for orchids and thinking about giving their Phalaenopsis a little chill at the end of the month to get it to initiate flowering. Lots of things to do in the orchid growing area this month.
Yep, it's that time.
So thank you all. We appreciate your being here.
Thank you.
See everybody soon.
See you soon.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.